The morning my granddaughter turned 1 year old, I was sitting alone in my kitchen in San Antonio eating cereal out of the box because I hadn't bothered to go grocery shopping in 3 days. I knew the party was happening. I had bought the gift 2 weeks earlier, a handmade wooden rocking horse from a craftsman in Fredericksburg, the kind my own father had made for me when I was small. I had wrapped it myself with yellow ribbon because yellow was supposed to be her favorite color, or at least that's what my son Daniel had told me back when he still told me things. I wasn't invited. I found out the way you find out most painful things when you're 67 years old and your family has quietly decided you're inconvenient through a photograph. My neighbor Linda showed me her phone over the fence that afternoon. The way people do when they think they're doing you a favor, but they're really just making sure the knife goes in all the way. There was Daniel, grinning with a paper crown on his head. There was my daughter-in-law Melissa, holding little Grace up toward the camera, both of them looking like a magazine cover. There were Melissa's parents, her 2 sisters, her brother-in-law. There was a clown, an actual clown, and a balloon arch in Grace's nursery colors. There was no me. I smiled at Linda and said something about how sweet it looked and went back inside and stood in my kitchen for a long time with both hands pressed flat on the counter, staring at the rocking horse in the corner with the yellow ribbon. I want to be honest with you. My first feeling wasn't anger. It was shame. The specific, humiliating shame of a man who has spent 3 years telling himself that things will get better, that his daughter-in-law just needs time to warm up, that his son is doing his best between 2 difficult people. The shame of a man who has been making excuses for people who never once made an excuse for him. Because I had been making excuses for a long time. Since Daniel married Melissa 4 years ago, I had been slowly, quietly funding a lifestyle that never once included me. It started small, a security deposit on their first apartment in Austin because they were short. Then car trouble, then medical bills when Melissa had a difficult pregnancy, then nursery furniture, then a new laptop for Daniel because he was between jobs for 11 months, which is a long way of saying he wasn't working and Melissa wasn't either, and somehow the bills still got paid because I was paying them. I'd kept a number in my head for the last year, the way you keep a number you're afraid to look at directly. A little over $38,000 over 3 years. My late wife Carol and I had built that money slowly, teaching school for 34 years between the 2 of us, brown bagging our lunches, driving our cars until the wheels fell off. Carol passed from cancer 2 years ago. The money was supposed to be my cushion, my comfort, the thing that kept me from being a burden to anyone. Instead, it had become the thing that made me invisible. I called Daniel that evening. Not to confront him, I wasn't ready for that, just to hear his voice. Just to see if he would say anything about the party, offer any explanation, any acknowledgement that his father had spent the day alone with a wrapped rocking horse and a box of cereal. Melissa answered, "Oh, Richard." Her voice had that particular flatness she used with me, the tone you use with a telemarketer you've decided not to be rude to, but also not to listen to. "Daniel's putting Grace to bed. Can I take a message?" "Take a message." From his father. I heard a burst of laughter in the background, other voices, music. The party was still going. "I just wanted to say happy birthday to Grace," I said. "I'll let her know," Melissa said. She was already distracted, already half gone. "Oh, and Richard, we're going to need help with the rent this month. The transmission on Daniel's car went out and it wiped us out. I'll have him text you the details." She hung up before I said anything. I stood there in my living room with the phone in my hand, and I felt something that had been trying to get my attention for 3 years finally stop knocking and simply walk through the door. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder than that. Clarity. I had not been invited to my granddaughter's first birthday party. And within the same phone call, I had been asked for money. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in Carol's chair, the green one by the window she used for reading, and I thought about the man I had been for the last 3 years versus the man I had spent the 64 years before that trying to be. The man before Carol died would never have accepted this. He would have had a direct conversation, drawn a line, demanded basic dignity. Somewhere in my grief, in my terror of losing the only family I had left, I had traded that man in for someone smaller, someone who could be dismissed, someone whose calls could go to voicemail. I went to my bank on Monday morning. My account manager's name was Patricia, a sharp woman about my age who had handled my accounts since I moved to San Antonio. I sat across from her and I told her I needed to stop all automatic transfers to an account in Daniel's name. 3 transfers, rent contribution, a monthly grocery supplement, and a miscellaneous fund I had set up after Grace was born because I told myself it was for diapers and formula, and not, as it turned out, for Melissa's monthly salon appointments, and a streaming bundle that cost more than my first car payment in 1987. Patricia didn't blink. She pulled up the accounts, confirmed the amounts, and began the paperwork. "Mr. Gallagher," she said quietly, "are you sure? These have been running for quite a while." "I'm sure," I said. "I'd also like to remove both names from any secondary access." She nodded. She looked like a woman who had seen this before. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing. By Tuesday evening, there were 11 texts from Daniel, ranging from confused to desperate. By Wednesday morning, Melissa called 4 times before I answered. "Richard, what is going on?" Her voice was different now. No flatness. This was sharp, awake, the voice she used when something actually mattered to her. "The bank said our transfers were canceled. There has to be a mistake." "No mistake," I said. Silence. Then, "Excuse me? I've stopped the transfers, Melissa. All of them. You can't just— Daniel, get in here." She was calling for my son like a general calling reinforcements. "Richard, those transfers are how we pay our rent. You can't just pull that without any notice." "You didn't give me notice about Grace's birthday party," I said. It was the first time I had said it out loud, and it felt different than I expected. Not dramatic, just true. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Melissa laughed. That laugh. The one I had heard maybe 100 times in 4 years. The one that meant she had decided I was beneath a real response. "Oh my God. You're doing this because you weren't at the party? Richard, you're a grown adult. We had it catered and the space was limited, and frankly, Grace is 1 year old. She doesn't even know who was there. She knows her grandfather wasn't," I said. Daniel took the phone. "Dad." His voice was the voice he had used since he was 16. The voice that meant he wanted me to back down so everyone could be comfortable again. "Dad, look, I'm sorry about the party, okay? Melissa's family it got complicated. We should have said something. I get that. But the rent is due Friday and we genuinely don't have it." "I know you don't," I said. "That's been true every month for 3 years. Dad, I love you, Daniel. But I'm done funding people who don't include me in their lives. When you're ready to have a real conversation, call me." I hung up. The feeling that came after was not what I expected. I expected guilt. I had been carrying so much guilt for so long, the preemptive guilt of a father who is always afraid he isn't doing enough. What I felt instead was something I hadn't felt since Carol was alive. I felt like myself. 3 days later, my sister came to visit. My younger sister Ruth is 62 years old and works as a financial fraud investigator for a regional bank consortium in Houston. She has never in her life said something she didn't mean, never softened a truth to make it easier to swallow, and after Carol died, she became the person I called when the silence got too heavy. She drove up on a Saturday with a casserole and a look on her face that told me she already knew more than I'd told her. We sat on the back porch and I told her everything. The party, the phone call, the 3 years, the $38,000. When I finished, she was quiet for a while, which from Ruth means she is organizing something sharp. "Richard," she said finally, "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead. Have you ever looked at what the money was actually being spent on?" I assumed. "I know what you assumed. But have you looked?" I hadn't. I had been sending money into an account I had partial visibility on, and I had never once pulled the statements because pulling the statements would have meant confronting what the statements said, and I had not been ready for that. Ruth pulled out her laptop. She is, at her core, a woman who comes prepared. What she showed me over the next hour rearranged the furniture in my understanding of the last 3 years. The rent. Yes, that checked out. The rent was real. The medical bills from the pregnancy. Real. But a significant portion of what I had been calling the miscellaneous fund had been going somewhere else entirely. Small transfers. Irregular amounts. Nothing large enough to flag automatically. $300 here, $200 there, sometimes weekly. Over 18 months, it added up to just under $9,000. And it was all going to the same account. An account that wasn't Daniel's. "Who is Kevin Marsh?" Ruth asked. I had never heard that name. Ruth's expression told me she had already looked him up. "He lives in Nashville," she said carefully. "He and Melissa went to college together. According to his public social media, which is set to open, He's been posting photos of a pretty comfortable life for the past year and a half. New truck. Vacation in Cancun. Ruth turned the laptop toward me. Several photos of him with a woman whose face was partially obscured. The woman's earrings were visible in two of them. They were distinctive long gold drops with a small turquoise stone. I had given those earrings to Melissa as a Christmas gift 18 months ago because Daniel had said she liked turquoise. I sat back in my chair. "That's not all," Ruth said quietly. I ran a soft background on Melissa through some databases I have access to professionally. She leaned forward. "Richard, she has a judgment against her in Georgia from 2018. She was sued by an elderly man named Howard Garfield. The case was settled and sealed, but the filing itself is public record. The filing describes a pattern of financial exploitation. He was 71. She was married to his son. The casserole went cold on the table between us. "His son," I said. "They divorced in 2019, Ruth said. "Daniel is her second husband." I thought about my son, his easy trust, his gentle nature, the way he had always wanted everyone around him to be happy. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been choosing the path of least resistance his entire life, and he had married a woman who knew exactly how to make the wrong path feel like the easy one. I thought about the $9,000 going to a man in Nashville. I thought about a sealed judgment in Georgia. I thought about a 67-year-old man named Howard Garfield who had probably also sat in a kitchen somewhere, telling himself that things would get better. I thought about Carol, about the 34 years of brown bag lunches. "Ruth," I said, "I want to do this right." She closed the laptop. "Tell me what right looks like to you." "I want proof. I want it documented, organized, undeniable. I don't want to be the bitter old man who couldn't let go of a grudge. I want to be the man with evidence." Ruth smiled. "That," she said, "is exactly the kind of problem I know how to solve." Over the following 2 weeks, Ruth worked with the focus of someone who has spent 30 years untangling deliberate financial misdirection. She pulled transaction records going back to the beginning of the transfers, cross-referenced the amounts and timing of the payments to Kevin Marsh's account, documented the pattern. She reached out quietly through professional channels to a colleague in Atlanta who confirmed that the Garfield case, while sealed, had ended with a significant private settlement and that the woman in question had moved to Texas shortly after. She found 2 more data points, a complaint filed with the Better Business Bureau in Georgia under a slightly different name that matched enough identifying details, and a social media account, now deleted, that had listed both Georgia and Texas as home states. She also found something else. The transfers to Kevin Marsh hadn't stopped. They were still going, once a month, $400, like clockwork. While Melissa was calling me on a Wednesday morning to tell me the rent was overdue, $400 of what had previously been my money had already left for Nashville 5 days earlier. Ruth brought everything to a lawyer she trusted in San Antonio. His name was Frank Delgado, and he had the kind of office that told you without saying it that he had won more cases than he had lost. He wore his reading glasses on top of his head, and he went through every document with the thoroughness of a man who understands that detail is the difference between justice and noise. "What you have here," Frank said, tapping the stack of papers, "is a civil fraud case with teeth. The pattern of transfers to a third party without the knowledge of the account holder, the prior judgment in Georgia, the documented history of financial exploitation of an elderly person." He looked up at me over his glasses. "A second elderly person, we should say. This is not nothing. This is a strong case." "What about Daniel?" I asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what Daniel knew. If he was unaware of the transfers to this Kevin Marsh, he may actually be a victim here too. If he knew and said nothing, that complicates things. We need to talk to him before we file anything." I hadn't spoken to Daniel in 2 weeks. His texts had gone from frantic to wounded to silent, the natural progression of a person who was waiting for me to feel guilty enough to give in. I had not given in, but I also had not told him what I knew. I drove to Austin on a Thursday morning in October, the kind of morning when the Texas hill country turns gold along the highway, and you can almost forget that the world contains people who will steal from you. Daniel met me at the door. Melissa's car was gone. I had timed it that way. Had asked him to make sure she wasn't there without explaining why, and he had done it with the anxious compliance of a person who senses something is coming but doesn't know its shape yet. We sat at the kitchen table. I put Ruth's documentation in front of him without preamble. "I want you to look at this," I said. "All of it. Take your time." He took 40 minutes. I watched him go pale, somewhere around the 3rd page. I watched his hands go still around the 6th. When he finished, he sat with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a long time and didn't say anything. Finally, "I didn't know about the transfers. I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know." "I believe you." He looked up. The expression on his face was the one I hadn't seen in 4 years, the one that belonged to my son and not to the man who had stood behind his wife while she dismissed me. He looked genuinely broken open. "The man in Nashville," I said carefully. "She told me he was her college roommate's brother," Daniel said. "She said she helped him out sometimes because his family was going through a rough time. She said he stopped. She said it wasn't a big deal, that it was her money." "It was my money," I said. I said it without anger, just as a fact. He closed his eyes. I told him about Howard Garfield. I told him about the Georgia judgment. I watched my son learn who he had married, and I felt grief for him alongside everything else. Because the grief was appropriate and real, and because whatever came next, he was going to have to rebuild something from a foundation he didn't know had been hollow. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said. "Not about the party. About all of it. About the last 3 years." "I know. What do we do now?" "We do this right," I said. Frank Delgado filed the civil suit on a Monday. By Wednesday, the criminal complaint had been submitted to the district attorney's office, elder financial abuse, fraud, and a 3rd charge related to the undisclosed prior judgment that Frank's colleague had surfaced through a technicality in how the settlement had been structured. By Thursday, Melissa's lawyer was calling Frank's office with a tone that suggested someone had, for the first time, made her feel the weight of what she had done. Daniel had moved into his mother's best friend's house across town. He and Melissa had separated. He was not part of the legal action against her. The documentation was clear enough that his ignorance was credible, but he was a witness, and he had agreed to be one without hesitation. I think that was the first time in 4 years I had seen my son make a hard choice quickly. The civil hearing was 3 months later. I want to tell you about the moment that mattered most to me. And it was not the moment the judge ruled in my favor, though she did. It was not the moment Melissa's face went rigid when Ruth took the stand and walked the court through 18 months of documented transfers with the calm precision of a woman who has done this 100 times. It was not even the moment Frank read aloud from the Georgia filing and Melissa's lawyer stopped writing notes and stared at the table. It was the moment Melissa looked at me. It happened during a recess. She was standing near the water fountain with her attorney, and I walked past to get to the hallway, and she looked at me the way you look at something you've miscalculated badly, not with contempt, with the particular expression of someone who chose a target they were sure was soft and discovered too late that it wasn't. I nodded at her, the way you nod at someone you've never been afraid of. I kept walking. The judgment was full restitution of the documented $9,000 in third-party transfers, plus punitive damages and legal fees totaling just under $60,000. The criminal charges moved forward separately. That process takes longer, as it should. Frank told me the district attorney was motivated, partly because of the Georgia record, partly because elder financial fraud cases had become a priority in the county. He told me to expect a resolution within the year. I didn't wait for the criminal case to start building my life back. The week after the civil judgment, I went back to Fredericksburg and I bought myself a hand-tooled leather belt from a craftsman on the main street. Not because I needed it, but because Carol always said I never bought myself anything nice, and she was right. And I had decided she was going to stay right about a lot of things, but not about that anymore. I booked a trip to the Oregon coast, somewhere I had always wanted to go and had always deferred, because there was never a right time. Which is another way of saying there was always a reason to stay small. Daniel came to San Antonio for Thanksgiving. Just the two of us. Because rebuilding something takes time and honesty and a willingness to sit in the discomfort of what got broken before you can talk about what comes next. We made Carol's cornbread dressing from the index card she had written it on in 1991. The handwriting faded, but still hers. And we ate at the table where I had eaten alone for 2 years, and for one meal it felt like a table again instead of a monument. He told me he was in therapy. He told me he had started looking at why he had always chosen ease over honesty, why he had stood back and let his wife fill every silence with her version of events and had never once asked whether her version was true. He told me he was ashamed. I told him shame was only useful for about 15 minutes, after which it was just an excuse to stay stuck. Carol used to say that. He laughed in a way that meant he remembered her saying it too. I told him about Grace's rocking horse. I had kept it. He said he'd bring her to see me in the spring, that she was walking now, that she had a laugh that sounded exactly like my laugh when something surprised me. I didn't know my laugh had that quality. I sat with that for a while. I want to tell you what I've learned, not as a list of lessons, but as the things that are actually true for me now on the other side of this. At 67 years old, sitting in my kitchen with the morning light coming through Carol's curtains. The first thing is that generosity is not the same thing as love, and for a long time I confused them. I thought that giving freely was a way of expressing that I cared. And it is, when the other person sees it that way. But you can give and give and give to someone who has decided you are a mechanism rather than a person, and your generosity will not change their mind. It will only empty you. Love requires both people to be present. Generosity with someone who is absent is just loss. The second thing is about loneliness, which is what I was really trying to solve with the money. Carol died and I was afraid of the silence, and Daniel and Melissa were a way of staying connected to something that felt like family. I was willing to pay for that connection because I was afraid there was no other kind available to me. I was wrong, but the fear was real, and I don't judge myself for it. Grief makes you reach for whatever you can hold. The mistake was not reaching. The mistake was holding on too long after my hands told me nothing was holding back. The third thing I learned is about my son. Daniel is not a villain in this story. He is a man who learned too late that avoiding conflict is its own kind of violence, the slow kind that doesn't look like damage until the foundation cracks. He is learning something different now, and I am choosing to believe that learning is real, not because I need to believe it, but because the evidence, so far, supports it. I am watching, with open eyes this time. And the fourth thing, the most important one, is this. There is no age at which you stop deserving dignity. I had somehow accepted the idea that being old and alone and grieving meant I was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging came my way. That my needs were a burden and my hurt was an overreaction and my money was more valuable than my presence. I had accepted being made small and called it humility. It wasn't humility. It was disappearing. And I had done it to myself just as much as anyone had done it to me. I stopped disappearing. Ruth and I have started having dinner together every other Sunday, alternating between San Antonio and Houston, something we never did enough of when Carol was alive and we were all busy with the forward motion of living. She is funny in a way I had forgotten, quick and dry, and she tells stories about her work that make me feel like the world is full of complicated people doing complicated things, and that most of them, when someone pays close enough attention, can be understood. Grace came to visit in April. She is 18 months old, and she has decided, for reasons known only to herself, that the rocking horse is the greatest object in the world. I watched her climb on it with the focused determination of someone who has decided that obstacles are just interesting problems, and I thought about the man who had been sitting in this kitchen 6 months earlier eating cereal out of the box. He felt very far away. My name is Richard Gallagher. I am 67 years old. I spent 3 years making myself smaller to keep people comfortable, and I spent 6 months making myself large enough to hold the truth. And I am here to tell you that the second thing is better. It costs more in the short run. It costs so much less in the long one. If you are listening to this, and you recognize the kitchen and the cereal box and the phone that rings and only ever wants something from you, I want you to hear this directly. You are not too old to stop. You are not too invested to walk away from what isn't working. The money is not the point. The money is just the visible version of the thing you've been giving that costs more than money. Your attention, your time, your willingness to be treated as less than you are. Stop giving that. Start accounting for it the way you'd account for anything valuable, because it is the most valuable thing you have. You have been patient long enough. You have been generous long enough. You have been quiet long enough. The table is yours. Sit at the head of it.